Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a frontier. And the first thing to say is stay safe, exercise social distancing, and be really, really careful because, it gives me no satisfaction to have become so obsessed with this because I saw the mathematics of it. I really think the viral moment has arrived now. And you've got to be mind-bendingly silly not to understand that. So please, the first thing is really take care and look after your family, and specifically older people, avoid getting close to them because clearly they're very, very vulnerable. Let me start first with macro thoughts. The Fed announced 150 basis points in emergency rate cuts, $1.5 trillion in term financing, $700 billion in new QE, and I am the fearmonger, says Epsilon Theory. Futures are way down. Why? Because this is a medical crisis, not a market crisis. Clowns. And I've made that point severally, and I even said that if they cut rates, it's going to make no difference. But essentially, they've got to do something. I quoted William Burroughs previously, and the non-linear and exponential virus represents the greatest risk to a control machine in point of fact. Global central bank update, Fed cut rates by 100 basis points to an all-time low. New Zealand cut rates by 75 basis points. Canada, another 50 basis points, that was late on Friday. Norway cut 50 basis points to 1%. Many more cuts to come, Charlie Bilello. As I wrote some weeks ago, what is becoming increasingly clear is that the world's economists and policymakers are linear in their thinking and their response, and are flummoxed by the exponential and multiplicative nature of the coronavirus. The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function, Professor Alan Bartlett. Below is a one-day tick chart of the one-month T-bill. Yes, it is very illiquid now. February 27, it was at 1.5%. March 15 low, negative 0.28 basis points. That's from Bianco Research, who also has been a tremendous resource in these times. Lowest yield ever recorded in US history. Negative rates have arrived in the US. With realized vols across all asset classes up 300% in 2 weeks, VAR has exploded, and that means liquidity is failing fast as no one can make a price in size. I wrote about this actually a number of years ago, 2016, in an article I started with the lyrics from Hotel California. And I said, this is what would happen in a crisis, and everyone will have to spill their positions because the way market risk is calculated is via vols. Gold had a terrible week last week, and I apologize for getting it so wrong. And really, I should have looked back more closely at history, because when you get a liquidity grab, the first thing people sell are their most valuable asset, which is gold. And we fell 8.6% last week, which was the largest drop since 1983. But now it's getting its groove back, and I would suggest that this is the time to load up on gold because rates are now deep in negative territory, real rates. And it really is, as I wrote a few weeks ago, the only antidote I can think of in the financial markets to this complete black swan that's been visited upon us. And so just to reiterate, I didn't expect it to fall so far. It's currently at 1545. I'd be a buyer with a stop just below 1500. The scale of China's slowdown revealed by the latest numbers for both industry and consumers is breathtaking. Now we need to know how quickly it can recover and whether it can get so bad in Europe and the Americas. This uncertainty will last a long time, and you will remember all those fantasy hopes for a V-shaped recovery just a few sessions ago, and they are a fantasy. And I think they've now been thoroughly dashed. In fact, as I said previously, China cannot just crank up the factory because that will risk a second round of infections. Let's take a little detour into some home thoughts. How good is your morning view? Discover Elmentaita. This photo is by Candu_. And I'll show you some others of Elmentaita. It's really a most beautiful vista. At my local supermarket, a clerk told me that their fresh shipment of toilet paper sold out in 15 minutes. People preparing for the shit apocalypse, said Stephen King. This is a photo I took of Lake Elmentaita when we stayed at Serena Hotels. There's a story in the Times about the British Army in Nanyuki misbehaving and importing 100 night girls into the premises. And I saw Michael Ramsey tweet, Nanyuki was always called No Nookie in my day for a reason. This is a photograph of the sunrise tinting the clouds at Mount Kenya, the Mount Kenya Safari Club, which is in Nanyuki. And Mount Kenya Safari Club in Nanyuki became a mecca for the international jet set. And I've been going there since I was a little boy, and I've written an article a few years ago. Have a read, William Holden, Stephanie Powers. It's just a fantastic place to visit. This photo of Chinese police and medical staff dealing with the coronavirus in the Altai Mountains is entirely my aesthetic, Jack Tyndale. Political reflections. Over 12,000 new cases of COVID-19 were reported today in the world. Exponential growth is observed in 14 of the 15 countries with the most cumulative cases. Exception South Korea. Cases are multiplying by 10 every 14 days and showed no sign of slowing down. And that is the point of a multiplicative, nonlinear, and exponential mathematical equation. Listen to every word. Professor John Ashton is a British doctor and academic. He worked at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, University of Liverpool School of Medicine. Very interesting. It's about 90 seconds. Just click and listen. This is all about Boris's herd immunity theory. Total cases reported worldwide just surpassed the total number of cases in China. I still have a great deal of skepticism about the numbers that were reported out of China, but subsequent to the dilly-dallying, they have taken a very algorithmic approach to the entire matter. And in fact, I think that is what has allowed them to bring this back under a degree of control. My model has a November 1st start date for the COVID-19, and therefore I'm very perplexed by the numbers, because when something makes no mathematical sense, I have found it to be nonsense. Unpublished documents from the Chinese Communist regime reveal a 55-year-old Wuhan patient suffered from the coronavirus as early as November 17, 2019, much earlier than officially announced. According to WHO, the first recorded case in China was on December the 8th, but you know my feelings about them. Mar-a-Lago is suddenly under a dark cloud as a nexus where the novel coronavirus could have spread among elites in the United States and around the world Politico. And just compare and contrast Trump's behavior with Xi Jinping. Do you remember? He went to Wuhan, but he remained in a room on a video conference, and they've been much more careful about exposing their leadership to the virus. In the company of the health minister, Bolsonaro greets supporters, takes selfies with them and shakes their hands. If he didn't have it last week, he's going to have it this week. At least 5 Brazilians who traveled with President Bolsonaro on a US visit, including meetings with his counterpart, President Trump, have tested positive for COVID-19, officials and media reports. 4-day trip to South Florida included a swanky dinner last Saturday at a Trump golf resort, had a surprise outcome. It appears to have become an infection cluster in the coronavirus pandemic. At least 6 people involved, the 5 Brazilians, plus Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, have now tested positive for COVID-19. This has led Trump and Bolsonaro, who had both been criticized for downplaying the gravity of the outbreak, to get tested themselves. Other top officials have meanwhile gone into self-quarantine. After the Brazilian government revealed Thursday that Bolsonaro's communications chief, Fabio Weingarten, had been infected, a string of others on the trip tested positive. Bolsonaro's lawyer, Karina Kufa, Senator Nelsinho Trad, announced their positive test results on Twitter. The Brazilian embassy in Washington tweeted that Bolsonaro's appointee for ambassador to the US, Nestor Forster, was infected as well. A businessman who was on the trip has also tested positive, asking that his identity not be revealed. Bolsonaro famously said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," at UNGA. COVID-19 daily infection rate is now higher in the US, about 50%, than in Europe, 25%, or Iran, 15%, according to the Marketeer. And indeed, the viral moment has arrived. For what it's worth, I did account for population size by showing the number of cases per 100,000. This is from Shin Yips 1. We are past the point of no return. This is an unprecedented moment, in my view, as I wrote on the 24th of February. Such tweets are still getting 8,500 likes, suggesting many in the US have not yet recognized what's coming, Charlie Robertson. And the tweet he was referring to was from Chuck Woolery. If you haven't figured that this media-driven panic is more about Trump hatred than honest reporting, you're not paying attention. Confirmed cases versus critical care beds, that's from Shah-in Valley. And this is an important data point, because what's happening is, once all those beds are filled, which is happening very quickly now, then you're getting a further spike up in death rates. Groucho Marx, who you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And then on the 16th of February, I was quoting that poem, "Let me tell you, world, I do not believe. If 1,000 challenges lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1,001. I don't believe the sky is blue. I don't believe in thunder's echoes. I don't believe that dreams are false. I don't believe that death has no revenge. And what he was referring to was the CCP response. And have a look at this short video from Jennifer, TNTD. If you hang out in public today, grass will grow on your grave tomorrow, is a Chinese banner that's in China at the moment. The real Donald Trump presidency is over, writes The Atlantic's Peter Vayner. For me, that is the paramount consideration in electing a president, in part because at some point it's reasonable to expect that a president will face an unprecedented crisis. And at that point, the president's judgment and discernment, his character and leadership ability will really matter. Mr. Trump has no desire to acquaint himself with most issues, let alone master them, is how I put it 4 years ago. No major presidential candidate has ever been quite as disdainful of knowledge, as indifferent to facts, as untroubled by his benightedness. It took until the second half of Trump's first term, but the crisis has arrived in the form of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's hard to name a president who has been as overwhelmed by a crisis as the coronavirus has overwhelmed Donald Trump. That said, the president and his administration are responsible for grave, costly errors, most especially the epic manufacturing failures in diagnostic testing, the decision to test too few people, the delay in expanding testing to labs outside the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and problems in the supply chain. These mistakes have left us blind and badly behind the curve. And for a few crucial weeks, they created a false sense of security. They've simply lost time they can't make up. You can't get back 6 weeks of blindness. It is failing, let's admit it. The idea of anybody getting testing easily the way people in other countries are doing it, we're not set up for that. I think it should be, but we're not. In some respects, the avalanche of false information from the president has been most alarming of all. It's been one rock slide after another, the likes of which we have never seen. Trump is in the process of discovering that he can't spin or tweet his way out of a pandemic. The president's misinformation and mendacity about the coronavirus are head-snapping. He claimed that it was contained in America when it was actually spreading. He claimed that we'd shut it down when we had not. He claimed that testing was available when it wasn't. He claimed that coronavirus will one day disappear like a miracle. It won't. He claimed that a vaccine would be available in months. Fauci says it will not be available for a year or more. As the Washington Post's Dan Balz put it, almost everything that could have gone wrong with the speech did go wrong. With few exceptions, what Trump has said is not just useless, it's downright injurious. The coronavirus is quite likely to be the Trump presidency's inflection point, when everything changed, when the bluster and ignorance and shallowness of America's 45th president became undeniable and empirical reality, as indisputable as the laws of science or a mathematical equation. The president, enraged for having been unmasked, will become more desperate, more embittered, more unhinged. He knows nothing will be the same. His administration may stagger on, but it will only be a hollow shell. The Trump presidency is over. As I said previously, the market emits the purest signal, and the market has had it with Narcissus. This is reality TV at a whole new epic Shakespearean level. Trump has copied the wrong career, the sycophancy, incompetence and propaganda of the North, not the intelligence and execution of the South. Fareed Zakaria via Professor Galloway. I wrote, it will be a Trump viruside. He is already behind the curve, and the curve is parabolic, exponential and non-linear. It's over. Just finished a meeting on COVID-19 in the Situation Room, news conference coming up shortly. They are rather unputdownable, those news conferences, not for the right reasons, however. Will he be remembered as the president that brought us the bear market? Biden is now pulling ahead of Trump and is going to be a shoo-in by November. The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. Professor Alan Bartlett. Alas, we have math deniers to deal with. Michael E. Mann. Coronavirus timeline, January 19, 100 cases, January 24, 1,000 cases, January 28, 5,000 cases, February 12, 50,000 cases, March 6, 100,000 cases, March 14, 150,000 cases. That's the exponential function. And as I said, what is absolutely clear now is we're dealing with a virus that has turned exponential, non-linear, and is a pandemic. Gladwell called it the tipping point, the moment in an epidemic when a virus reaches critical mass. It's the boiling point. It's the moment on the graph when the line starts to shoot straight upwards. If you look at the history of cults, there are numerous instances of the cult leader, Jim Jones, Jonestown as an example, leading their followers to their death. And this COVID-19 is apocalyptic and a failure to teach citizens mathematics. There is a super essay by Thomas Puyo, Coronavirus, Why You Must Act Now. The coronavirus is coming to you. It's coming at an exponential speed, gradually and then suddenly. It's a matter of days, maybe a week or two. The only way to prevent this is social distancing today, not tomorrow, today. That means keeping as many people home as possible, starting now. This was total worldwide cases through March the 10th, total worldwide cases outside China through March the 10th. Chart 3, coronavirus through March the 10th by country. Chart 4, coronavirus through March the 10th by country as well. Dozens of countries with exponential growth rates, most of them in the Western world. Chart 5, daily growth rate of cases between 5th March and 6th March. He then gave us a timeline of events in Hubei. Crucially, these cases weren't known at the time. We can only figure them out looking backwards. The authorities don't know that somebody just started having symptoms. They know when somebody goes to the doctor and gets diagnosed. What this means is that the orange bars show you what authorities knew and the grey ones what was really happening. On January 21st, the number of new diagnosed cases, orange, is exploding. There are around 100 new cases. In reality, there were 1,500 new cases that day, growing exponentially, but the authorities didn't know that. What they knew was that suddenly there were 100 new cases of this new illness. 2 days later, authorities shut down Wuhan. At that point, the number of diagnosed daily new cases was 400. Note that number. They made a decision to close the city with just 400 new cases in a day. In reality, there were 2,500 new cases that day, but they didn't know that. Up until January 23rd, when Wuhan closes, you can look at the grey graph. It's growing exponentially. True cases were exploding. As soon as Wuhan shuts down, cases slow down. On Jan 24th, when another 15 cities shut down, the number of true cases, again grey, grinds to a halt. 2 days later, The maximum number of true cases was reached, and it has gone down ever since. The concept of official and true cases is important. Let's keep it in mind for later. Washington State, you've already seen the growth in Western countries and how bad forecasts of just 1 week look like. Now imagine that containment doesn't happen like in Wuhan or in other Eastern countries, and you get a colossal epidemic. Chart 10, Washington State. Is the US's Wuhan? The number of cases there is growing exponentially. It's currently at 140. But something interesting happened early on. The death rate was through the roof. At some point, the state had 3 cases and 1 death. We know from other places that the death rate of the coronavirus is anything between 0.5% and 5%. More on that later. How could the death rate be 33%? It turned out that the virus had been spreading undetected for weeks. It's not like there were only 3 cases. It's that authorities only knew about 3. And one of them was dead because the more serious the condition, the more likely somebody is to be tested. This is a little bit like the orange and grey bars in China. Here they only knew about the orange bars, official cases, and they looked good. But in reality there were hundreds, maybe thousands of true cases. First, through deaths. If you have deaths in your region, you can use that to guess the number of true current cases. We know approximately how long it takes for that person to go from catching the virus to dying, on average 17.3 days. That means the person who died on the 22nd of February in Washington State probably got infected around the 12th of February. Now use the average doubling time for the coronavirus, time it takes to double cases on average, it's 6.2. That means in the 17 days it took this person to die, the cases had to multiply by 8 brackets 2, 17 divided by 6 close brackets. That means that if you're not diagnosing all cases, 1 death today means 800 true cases today. Washington State has today 22 deaths. With that quick calculation, you get 16,000 true coronavirus cases today, as many as the official cases in Italy and Iran combined. If we look into that detail, we realize that 19 of these deaths were from one cluster, which might not have spread the virus widely. So if we consider those 19 deaths as 1, the total deaths in the state is 4. Updating the model with that number, we still get 3,000 cases today. Have a look at this, tests per million. France claims 1,400 cases today and 30 deaths. Using the 2 methods above, you can have a range of cases between 24,000 and 140,000. The true number of coronavirus cases in France today is likely to be between 24,000 and 140,000. Let me repeat that. The number of true cases in France is likely to be between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude higher than it is officially reported. Same math applies to Paris. With 30 cases inside the city, the true number of cases is likely to be in the hundreds, maybe thousands. It's a tremendous article, really interesting. Have a look at it. Chart 12, fatality rate. Then he's diving into this problem with ventilators and ECMO machines, where we can see the speed, the exponential speed of this virus means that you max out extremely quickly. A UK starting assumption is that a high number of the population will inevitably get infected, whatever is done, up to 80%. As you can't stop it, it is best to manage it. This is the herd immunity theory. There are limited health resources, so the aim is to manage the flow of the seriously ill to these. The Italian model aims to stop infection. The UK wants infection, but of particular categories of people. The aim of the UK is to have as many lower risk people infected as possible. Immune people cannot infect others. The more there are, the lower the risk of infection. Kids generally don't get very ill, so the government can use them as a tool to infect others when you want to increase infection. When you need to slow infection, that tap can be turned off. At that point, they close the schools. Politically risky for them to say this. The assumption that the population won't start rioting when they realize that they are expendable is what underlies that theory. One young city, Hunan province, found 5 patients who are tested positive for coronavirus with no symptoms. Their CT scan results show no infection in the lung. That's William Yang. Well, let's move on to the markets. The Dow Jones, this is what it looked like, but we're now down, limit down this morning already. The Dow is going to give back all the gains going back to January 2017, says the FX Pip Titan. Currency markets, euro is at 111.47, dollar index 98.178, Japanese yen 106.33, Swiss franc 0.9493, the British pound 123.62, the Australian dollar is at 0.6154, Kiwi dollar rebounded, having gone below 60 on the rate cut news, India rupee 74.0225, South Korean won 12.2196. The Rial, which hit 5 last week, is at 4.86. South African Rand is at 16.37, and the Egyptian Pound 15.67. This is a chart of the dollar index from FX Pip Titan. It's a difficult one to call, really. There is a tremendous dollar shortage, obviously, but at the same time, the Fed is obviously going to cut below zero. Euro dollar, as I said, 111.48. Commodity markets, gold 15.45, 15.46. It's been a torrid time for gold bugs, but essentially I think we're turning higher now. And as I said in the earlier part of this podcast, I think you buy it now with a stop below 1,500. Crude oil, $30.90. Demand has collapsed as the world shuts down, obviously. Emerging markets in the 5 days through Friday, MSCI index of developing nations stocks crashed 12%, the most since the 2008 global financial crisis. Mexican and Colombian pesos each depreciated more than 8% against the dollar to record lows, battered by Brent oil slide below $35 a barrel. Average sovereign dollar bond spreads blew out by 122 basis points to levels not reached in more than a decade. Brazil's Ibovespa tumbled as much as 20%, extending this year's loss to almost 50% in dollar terms. The China emerging markets, frontier markets feedback loop phenomenon. Sub-Saharan Africa, video of locusts migrating in the desert during strong wind. The swarms form a group in teardrop shape pointing at the wind to prevent single locusts to be blown away. That's from W.B. Yeats, 1865. My article, you will recall, was about debt, virus and locusts creating a perfect storm for Africa, and I was speaking about how the year had begun with such promise, but those promises have been dashed. And I said these forecasts are now defunct, and it's only March. The issue at hand is around the violence of the blowback from the China coronavirus feedback loop phenomenon. The virus is not correlated to endogenous market dynamics, but is an exogenous uncertainty that remains unresolved, and therefore it is a black swan. I was saying, there were lots of stories about how somehow Africa was immune to this virus, and the problem was an American-style problem. Diagnostic kits were only recently availed. And if South Korea tested the same number of people as the entire African continent, they too would be reporting single-digit cases. Africa is not reporting single-digit cases no more. We all know what exponential disease propagation looks like in the real world. Real-world exponential growth looks like nothing, nothing, nothing. Cluster, cluster, cluster. and that's the phase we're in here, then boom. And I was highly skeptical that we were going to dodge this coronavirus infection bullet. There, a lot of people got upset when I sort of predicted that according to the mathematics. And fantasy predictions of a V-shaped recovery in China have been dashed, which also applies to Africa because of the tight correlation between the two. I said you don't have to be a rocket scientist or an economist to calculate which countries are directly in the line of fire. Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, DR Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Zambia, Nigeria, and South Africa spring immediately to mind. Basically I was saying that, you know, the top 3 countries are going to be at negative 2% GDP this year. And now Bloomberg, next Africa, hello oil and virus shocks, goodbye economic growth. Any hope sub-Saharan Africa had of strong economic growth in 2020 is gone. The pandemic is affecting everything from tourism to the ability of African countries to sell Eurobonds. Importing countries will benefit from lower costs. But Dirk Willem de Velde of the London-based Overseas Development Institute estimates the continent will lose about $30 billion in net exports this year should oil prices stay at current levels, and I think they'll go low actually. That could reduce foreign investment and make it more difficult to service debt in a region that's amassed borrowing like never before. Nigeria and Angola, the 2 biggest oil producers, have assumed prices of $57 and $55 a barrel in their budgets respectively. Brent crude is currently around $33. For Nigeria, which depends on oil for 60% of fiscal revenue and 90% of foreign exchange, that's a disaster. Angola is even more reliant on the fuel. The 2 countries already struggling to sell their oil. Nigerian National Petroleum said this week 50 Nigerian oil cargoes have been stranded as traders can't find buyers. This chart shows Nigeria's Naira coming under pressure last week. Traders of non-deliverable forwards are pricing in a big devaluation over the next year. I know the central bank is doing a finger in the dike act, but this is now predictable and inevitable. I wrote about it in an article, COVID-19, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the R word, R was recession. Zambia, which I think is in desperate trouble. If you look at the Eurobond, I called the canary in the coal mine on the 14th of October. Here you see Kenya and Angola Eurobond yields soar, that's via Mir Thakkar. Ramaphosa says that South African cases up to 61 from 38 on Friday, now seeing internal transmission, declares a national disaster and says there will be drastic measures. Nothing, 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 cluster, 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 boom. That's where South Africa is. As I said, we are weeks away from the boom in Africa. I said that on the 24th. WHO, African continent, according to them, 309 confirmed cases. US tells Ethiopia of Marine who had positive coronavirus tests. Told the government that an American Marine visiting the country in February showed symptoms of the coronavirus while there and later tested positive after staying at a hotel at the same time as Secretary of State Michael Pompeo. People familiar with the matter said the Marine, whose identity hasn't been released, stayed at the Sheraton, that's a Petri dish in Addis Ababa, for the African Land Forces Summit that took place on February 18 to February 21. He showed symptoms while there. The people said he later tested positive for the virus and is now getting treatment in the US. Health Minister Leah Tedesse said the country was still investigating the case of the American Marine who she said was in the country February 17 to 21. Look, they've got, in my view, hundreds and hundreds of cases. If you do an Iranian-type backwards calculation, the fact that this one guy has got it tells you there are many cases. The Ministry of Health in Rwanda confirmed its first case in the country, then has confirmed some more this morning. We are indeed past the point of no return. Wuhan went from an index case in November 2019 to several thousand cases by mid-January 2020, thus going from initial seeding event to widespread local transmission in the span of 10 weeks. Viruses exhibit non-linear and exponential characteristics. I spoke with Bruce Whitfield about my extreme concerns about the coronavirus a few weeks ago. 27th of January, I said I have to assume that the virus is already in Africa, but just not diagnosed. I call that a racing certainty. 3rd of February, I said Bole is the epicenter of China-Africa connectedness. Locusts continue to wreak havoc on crops in highlighted regions, crops that could feed 84 million people destroyed. That's why the title of my article was Debt, Virus and Locusts. Africa's economic growth may slow to 1.8% this year from 3.2% as global supply chains are disrupted and investments drop, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Oil exporting African nations are likely to be the hardest hit, with the Commission forecasting revenue losses of as much as $65 billion this year. I have 1% in my model for African growth, and Nigeria, South Africa and Angola at -2% for full year 2020, at a minimum. South African All Shares down 22.61% so far this year. Dollar Rand 16.3789, Egyptian Pound 15.67, EGX 30 down 27.31% year to date. Nigerian All Share down 15.3% year to date. Ghana Stock Exchange down 3.16% year to date. That's doing rather well. Kenya halted the entry of foreigners from countries that have confirmed coronavirus cases and suspended schools in a bid to reduce the risk of contagion within the East African country. Nurses at Mbagathi Hospital stage a go-slow site, lack of adequate coronavirus training and little support to protect their families. Trading at the NSE was halted on Friday. It will be halted again today. The Nairobi All Share is down 19.68% year to date, and the NSE20 is down 19.95% year to date. Thank you for listening.